winter I remember best arrived without asking, the way some people do, quietly, carrying a weight no one sees at first. Snow pressed itself against the windows of Dry Creek like a held breath, softening the town's sharp edges while sharpening its judgments. I was there the night Clara May Holloway spoke the words that would follow her for months, maybe years. She said them gently, as if kindness could dull their warning. "You'll regret choosing me." The lantern light caught the pale steam of her breath, and for a moment it looked like she was already disappearing. Elias Crown stood across from her, hat in his hands, snow melting into the creases of his gloves. He had the look of a man shaped by seasons rather than moments, broad shoulders, eyes that didn't rush to conclusions. When he smiled, it wasn't defiance or pride that moved his mouth, but patience. "I only regret waiting so long," he said, as if regret were a thing you could measure, like distance or time. The words fell into the silence and stayed there, heavy enough to make the onlookers shift their feet. Dry Creek had opinions about Clara long before that night. Towns always do. They remember what suits them and forget what complicates their comfort. Some said she was trouble because trouble had once found her. Others whispered as if the cold itself might overhear. No one spoke of how she'd survived when survival was all that was offered to her, or how a woman learns to carry herself when she's learned the cost of leaning on anyone. Gossip is an easy warmth. It keeps hands busy and hearts untouched. Clara knew all of it. You could see it in the way she held her shoulders, like she was bracing against a wind that never stopped. Her eyes didn't beg or challenge. They assessed, measured exits. When she warned Elias, it wasn't theater. It was habit. She had learned to name the ending early, to soften the blow before it landed. That was her mercy, both to others and herself. Later, when the crowd thinned and the night reclaimed its quiet, Clara walked alone through streets glazed with ice. Each step sounded too loud. She passed the church where light still burned for those who believed warmth could be summoned by prayer alone. She didn't go in. Faith for her had become a private thing, small, careful, like a coal cupped in the palm. In her rented room above the dry goods store, she lit a single lamp and sat without removing her coat. The walls were thin. The town breathed around her. She thought of all the times she'd been chosen for the wrong reasons, and the times she'd been left because choosing her took more courage than people wanted to spend. She pressed her thumb into a crack in the table and told herself that warning a man like Elias Crown was a kindness. Men with land and steady hands didn't need women with a past that could be used against them. She had learned that lesson early, learned it again whenever she forgot. Across town, Elias moved through his own quiet preparations. His ranch sat just beyond the river bend, where the land opened into a bowl of frost and grass that refused to give up entirely. He didn't pace or argue with himself. He built fires the way he always had, carefully, with attention to what would last. He fixed a hinge that had complained for months. He placed an extra blanket at the foot of the spare bed and left a lantern lit in the hallway, not because it was dark, but because darkness can feel like a test. He didn't rehearse speeches. He had learned that words often arrived late and left early, but small acts stayed. When Clara arrived the next evening, snow clinging to her boots, he took her coat, without comment, and hung it near the stove. The soup on the table smelled of onions and bone, the kind of meal that asked nothing in return. They ate slowly. Their spoons marked time. When she finished, she reached for the bowl as if to wash it, and he nodded once, a permission she hadn't realized she needed. In the quiet that followed, she noticed the lantern burning low and steady, and something in her chest eased, just enough to be noticed. The days that followed learned their own rhythm. Winter chores do that. They demand attention without drama. Elias split wood with a measured swing, pausing when Clara stepped onto the porch so she wouldn't feel rushed. She found her hands remembered things her heart had forgotten. Mending, tending, keeping a space alive. He never asked where she'd learned to work so efficiently, and she didn't offer. Respect can be as simple as not asking for proof. In town, the talk thickened. Mrs. Dorothea Finch, who could quote scripture like a ledger, spoke with concern that tasted like vinegar. Caleb Brooke laughed into his whiskey and said he'd give it a month. Sheriff Amos Bell listened and said nothing, his silence carrying more weight than agreement. Judgment doesn't need permission, it only needs repetition. Clara felt it when they went into Dry Creek together for supplies. Eyes lingered. Conversations bent around them. She kept her chin level, but inside, old aches stirred. Elias walked beside her, close enough that their sleeves brushed now and then, not shielding her, just there. When a man muttered something unkind, Elias paused to retie a loose strap, giving Clara time to move ahead without spectacle. It was a small thing, and it mattered. That night, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor until the boards blurred. She had warned him. She had tried to save him from the slow work of being judged by association. She imagined a regret she had promised him taking shape, imagined it hardening into resentment. Her chest tightened with the familiar urge to leave before she was asked. She folded her clothes with care, an old ritual, and stopped only when she heard Elias moving down the hall. He didn't knock. He stood in the doorway, lantern light catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. "Storm's coming," he said, as if that explained everything. He set a second blanket on the chair and left. The door remained open. The lantern burned. Clara lay awake listening to the wind gather its voice. She thought about choice, how often it had been taken from her, how rarely it had been offered without condition. Elias had chosen without spectacle, and that unsettled her more than any promise could have. In the early hours, when the house creaked and the cold tested every seam, she slept. By morning, the ranch lay hushed beneath new snow. The world looked remade, as if last night's judgments had been erased by white. Clara stood at the window and watched Elias cross the yard, his breath a steady cloud. She didn't know what would come of staying. She knew only that, for now, the lantern was still lit, the door still open, and the winter, for all its cruelty, had not yet taken this small warmth away. Winter did not loosen its hold quickly, but it began to listen. Days lengthened by inches, light lingering on the ranch long enough for Clara to notice how Elias worked without watching himself be seen. He learned the weather by the way the horses shifted, and learned her by the way she paused before speaking, as if weighing which truths were safe to set down. Their closeness grew the way snow melts, uneven, quiet, revealing dark earth in small, honest patches. He brought her a mug warmed by the stove before she asked. She mended a tear in his coat without comment. Nothing was declared. Everything was understood. The town, however, did not forget so easily. Judgment has a longer memory than mercy. When Mrs. Finch arrived with a basket and a smile that never reached her eyes, Clara felt the old tightening return. The woman's words were careful, wrapped in concern and scripture, each syllable a test. Elias listened, thanked her, and carried the basket to the table without inviting the conversation to stay. After she left, Clara scrubbed her hands at the sink until her knuckles stung, ashamed of how quickly she'd felt reduced to rumor again. Elias set the kettle on and waited. When he spoke, it was only to ask if she'd like tea. She nodded. The kettle sang. The moment passed without spectacle, and something in her learned a new way to breathe. Still, the weight accumulated. In town, Caleb Brooke laughed too loud. At the store, the clerk's eyes slid away. Sheriff Bell tipped his hat and held it, a courtesy that felt like a question. Clara answered each day with work and quiet. At night, she lay awake counting the costs of staying. She had learned that belonging could be revoked. She had learned to leave before the leaving was done to her. The morning she decided to go, the sky was iron gray, the air sharp enough to cut. She folded the extra blanket Elias had given her and placed it neatly at the foot of the bed. The note she wrote was brief and careful, a map drawn to spare him the trouble of regret. She packed light. Survival teaches you what matters. When she stepped outside, the snow was falling again, fine and persistent, blurring edges until even the fence posts looked uncertain. Elias found the note after the door closed. He read it once, then again, not because it was unclear, but because it named a pain he recognized. He did not curse or hurry. He pulled on his coat, the one she had mended, and followed the path she would take, the one that cut through the cottonwoods toward the river bend. The snow softened his steps. He called her name once, then didn't. Some choices need space to turn around. She heard him anyway, the rhythm of another presence matching hers. When he stood in front of her, blocking the narrow crossing, she stopped. The river moved beneath its skin of ice, patient and cold. For a moment, neither spoke. The world held its breath. "I won't make promises I can't keep," Elias said finally. His voice carried the steadiness she had come to know. "I won't pretend this will be easy, but I won't regret choosing you. I only regret waiting long enough to let you believe you don't belong." The words did not rescue her. They did not lift her or save her from herself. They stood where they were and waited. Clara felt the old warning rise and fall without finding its way to her mouth. She looked at the river, at the ice holding just enough to seem certain. She thought of all the times she had been carried by fear disguised as kindness. She thought of the lantern burning when it did not have to. She turned back, not because he asked, but because she chose. The decision did not erase the town or its whispers. It named something stronger. When they walked together, her steps were slower, heavier, as if the ground itself required acknowledgement. Elias did not take her hand. He walked beside her, close enough to be counted. The town noticed. Mrs. Finch's mouth thinned. Caleb's laughter fell flat. Sheriff Bell nodded once, a small, public thing that mattered. Change does not announce itself. It accumulates in moments others overlook. Clara returned to the store with her head level. When a woman met her eyes and held them, surprised at her own courage, the air shifted. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition. Spring arrived the way it always does, by persistence rather than permission. Snow retreated into shade. The river spoke louder. On the ranch, Clara planted seeds with hands that trusted the ground. Elias watched from the fence, not guarding, simply there. They learned the work of being seen without flinching. At night, the lantern still burned, though darkness had less claim. They shared the table and the quiet. Sometimes, when the wind rose, Elias reached for the extra blanket out of habit, then smiled and set it aside. I tell you this not because their story is rare, but because it is common in ways we forget to honor. Dignity is not loud. Love does not rush to prove itself. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay. Stay when leaving would be easier. Stay when the past insists on repeating itself. Stay when the world says you are already decided. If this wintered tale warmed something in you, if it reminded you of the lanterns you've kept burning, walk with us a little longer. Subscribe to Wild West Tales, and let these quiet stories keep you company as the seasons turn.